Okay, we are at 1 p.m. And so, hello everyone. Welcome to the Congressional briefing on end of life of bioplastics. This is being hosted by the Alternate Fuels and Chemicals Coalition, ACC, and the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, DPP. We would like to thank the Governor of Delaware, John Carney, for sponsoring this briefing, which we believe is important to Delaware and our nation. And so I have the honor and privilege to introduce Mr. Kurt Foreman, appointed as President and CEO of Delaware Prosperity Partnership in 2018. DPP is the public-private economic development organization created to take the lead in promoting the state of Delaware as a premier business location for companies considering new locations or expansions, and to attract innovators. With that, I will turn it over to Kurt for some introductory remarks and to open the briefing.
Well, thank you, Ramani, and thanks to the AFCC and for all of you here today. I'm honored to be with you to hear about a topic that I know is relevant and important to lots of people around the world, let alone in our U.S. economies. We are excited about the developments going on in the plastics and bioplastic space, and are particularly excited about some of the new innovations happening in Delaware and at UD, one of our great area institutions and our flagship for Delaware. We're excited to be with you for today's discussion that'll feature experts at both emerging companies and leading universities to show how science is providing sustainable solutions for plastic recycling. You hear a lot about single-use plastics as a problem, and today you're going to hear about some very worthwhile solutions that could make a huge difference in our world. We're particularly pleased that you'll get to hear from several Delaware-based experts, including a person from DuPont and also UD's top-ranked College of Engineering. The panelists from UD's new Center for Plastics Innovation is something we're very proud of, and they received an $11.65 million grant this year from the Department of Energy to form one of the 6 new frontier research centers across the United States. So just like most industries, the chemistry industry is evolving. DuPont, that was formed here in about 1802, has been evolving as a company for over 200 years and spawning lots of very exciting and sustainable chemistry companies. Just a couple facts about Delaware that you may not know. 2/3 of the Fortune 500 companies are headquartered here. That means they're registered here and have a base here in Delaware. We have one of the lowest costs of doing business in the country. As I mentioned, UD is a top-ranked chemical engineering college and also top in engineering overall. And we are highly ranked as a place for patents and PhDs per capita. About 45 chemistry organizations call Delaware or have a footprint in Delaware, 16 of which are multi-billion-dollar companies. And the payroll here in Delaware is over $500 million generated from the chemistry companies here in Delaware. So it certainly is a part of our past. It's a part of our present that we're very proud of, and we're excited about the future that it has for both Delaware and our country. So pleased to be with you today, and I'm the only non-technical person you're going to hear from today, so good to get me out of the way first so you can really hear about the great things that are happening in our world that can make a difference on the issues of plastics. So I'm going to turn it back over, but thank you for letting us be part of this, and we're proud that this is a topic you're spending time on with these experts today.
Thank you, Kurt, for those opening remarks. What we will now do is turn over to the panel Let me start a screen share, which will put up some slides, and hopefully the attendees can look at it. So give me a minute here to turn it on. Just okay. You should see my screen, and I'm going to turn it and make it to become full screen, so we can do that, and then we can begin. And hopefully you're seeing the full screen, correct? Okay, my name is Ramni Narayan. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. I am a faculty member in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Science at Michigan State University. And I have been working in this field of bioplastics for a very long time, since I had a lot of hair to completely losing all my hair. So you can decide what the time frame is correspond to. Specifically, we are going to talk about end of life and bioplastics. So that's the two themes which is being put in, specifically targeting the area of plastics. I wanted to set the stage on this, so let me do that. Plastics have come under a lot of scrutiny, confusion, love it, hate it, it's there. They are lightweight, low cost, readily processable. They command unique, versatile properties, transparency, protection. And the key factor there is that the words protection and to protect the product, also the safety and hygiene. So it's not just to maintain the integrity of the product, but when that product moves from the manufacturer through the supply chain all the way to the end customers, it keeps the product safe. Clearly, there are issues that need addressing, which is what this briefing is all about. And the two areas, as you can see right here, is what I call the beginning of life. And you will hear a lot on the bio-renewable carbon-based or petrofossil carbon resources to be used to make these kinds of single-use disposable products, as you can see there, right from gloves to carry bags to liners to packaging to mulch film, all the way from agriculture. And the end of life. So the concerns over this ubiquitous, lightweight, persistent plastics, and more specifically, leakage into the oceans and on land. So we will talk about experts who will address this issue. And I want to introduce this area in a little bit more detail. So if you'll permit me, I'm going to go into my next slide to talk to you about the fact that the single-use plastics are not the only plastics out there. There are durable products, and one of the panelists who will address this in more detail from DuPont will talk about durable plastics that has a renewable biocarbon content, and he will address that. In the other point I wanted to make, and I promise you, you are in the right webinar, and this is not a chemistry session at all. Wanted to highlight certain things for you, if you would permit me, right? The first thing I wanted to highlight to you is the fact that the molecules we are talking about are all containing carbon across the board, these molecules. And the first question which is being addressed today is, where does those carbons come from for that company or that person's product, right? Does that originate from fossil petrol resources, or does it originate from plant biomass carbon resources? So here is a traditional polymers, which is used today, conventional plastics, called polyethylene, polypropylene, you've heard of them. About total plastics production is around 359 million tons, and 49% of that is represented by these molecules here, right? Don't have to know the structure, don't need the chemistry, just to know that they are carbon-carbon backbone polymers. And by the way, humans are also carbon-centric. We are also carbon-carbon backbone polymer based. So this is used considerably. And out of that, 40% goes into packaging. So 49% goes total, 40% of this is in packaging, right? 7% is in a molecule called PET. You can see that molecule over here. And this is what goes into your containers, pop bottles, and found everywhere, water bottles. So that's what you can think about. That's 7%. And you have another 8% of the urethanes, which is not listed here. There are other two products I want to point out to you. This is called PLA. Again, it is an ester backbone, except to note that there is a fundamental difference between this molecule and this molecule. And these are the microbially produced polymers. This is, we have on our panel, Corbion Total, who's one of the manufacturers. We have on our panel Danimer Scientific, which is going to address the polymer molecules of this type. We have, of course, polyester-based molecules, which is DuPont. And then when all of this is used and enters the waste stream, what are you going to do about it? And so we have multiple approaches to how to recover this carbon in a safe and efficacious way and either recycle it or make it a part of the biological carbon cycle like composting or anaerobic digestion. So you're going to hear multiple approaches to these kinds of technologies that what I call the beginning of life and what happens at the end of life. And how do you safely recover it and transition it into a useful product? And if I were to, and I'm a little stuck here, let me give me a minute here. I'll skip this, but just to point out that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and many of you have heard of it, do recognize the plastics and do suggest or recommend that ultimately we need to innovate. So you're going to see innovative materials to be recycled or composted. And in this innovation of recycling, it's not just the material part, but innovation in terms of technologies that can recover and recycle products in multiple ways. And you're going to see the panelists address this or circulate it. So with that small introduction, let me invite the first panelist, Professor Lashandra Corley from the University of Delaware, to talk more broadly on what the Center for Innovation is doing and to address some of these issues. So Professor Corley.
Wonderful. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ramani, for the nice introduction to our topic today. My name is Lashonda Corley. I'm a distinguished professor in the departments of Material Science and Engineering and Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at the University of Delaware. And most recently, the director for our newly established Department of Energy Frontier Research Center, the Center for Plastics Innovation, or CPI. Another panelist, Professor Thomas Epps, is the Deputy Director of CPI. CPI involves partners at the University of Delaware, where it's housed, the University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, UMass Amherst, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory, along with a very robust scientific advisory board comprised of industrial, academic, and national lab experts. CPI was established to really address the plastics waste problem that is a global grand challenge, designed to develop innovations in plastics recycling and upcycling via a systems and data-driven approach. Our mission is to address the hierarchy of waste streams, a very nice example of thinking about multi-layer packaging or multi-component mixtures via very innovative catalytic and functionalization strategies, ranging from more traditional chemical catalysis to enzymatic routes for functionalization and depolymerization, as well as new tools development with a focus on fundamental discoveries. Via an efficient and selective processes in CPI, we focus on three main areas related to plastics waste, with the focus on PET, HDPE, LDPE, PP, polypropylene, polystyrene, and PMMA, polymethyl methacrylate, through three thrust areas: the depolymerization to high value fuels, lubricants, polymers, and monomers, and two, via upcycling approaches to functional polymers. So can we take traditional waste streams and through, say, surface functionalization or enzymatic routes, create new functional polymer networks or other functional material systems? And then three, a focus on development of cross-cutting tools, utilizing data science, computation, and additive manufacturing to enable these initiatives. One of the great gifts of this particular center is the broad level of expertise brought together through, of course, our University of Delaware experts, as well as our other partner institutions, both academic and national lab, from everything from new catalytic development to materials processing and design and chemistry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, LaShondra. The next presenter will be Professor Thomas Epps, and he will provide a different facet to the Center for Plastics Innovation. So, Professor Epps, I will change the slide to reflect your slide, and you can talk about the topics we are discussing today. So.
All right, well, thank you very much. Still seeing the last slide.
Yeah,
So while we're getting straight, I'm Thomas Epps. I'm the Thomas and Kip Gushel Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at UD. And I also have a joint appointment in Material Science and Engineering and an affiliated appointment in Biomedical Engineering. As was mentioned, we have several new centers at the University of Delaware. One is that EFRC, so the Center for Plastics Innovation. I'm going to actually just speak a little bit about two other recent centers. So we have a new MRSEC that's funded by the National Science Foundation, which is an $18 million center that's focused on polymeric materials and adaptive responsive materials. And we also have a program which is highlighted on this slide, also sponsored by NSF, on growing convergence research. And in particular, we're interested in the problem of polymeric and plastics materials and life cycle management. One of the key challenges that we're addressing is actually how do we make more resilient, longer life materials from bio-based sources. And in our case, we look at how can we use lignin as our feedstock, which can be a very nice waste product that can also help the pulp and paper and biorefinery industries in terms of finding opportunities for their waste. How do we think about making new plastics, understanding the utility of these materials? How can we recycle them and really close the loop to have low impact production? In terms of doing this, what some of the things that we do are we also incorporate economic assessment, life cycle management, toxicity. So looking at not only our feedstocks, but also then our end products and how they impact not only humans, but other parts of the environment, the aquatic environment, and air quality as well. And two of our some of our main goals are to develop processes and that enable the fabrication of valuable performance advantage materials from bio-based feedstocks, and how to really link that to the ecosystem. And we're doing that by doing things like pursuing selective catalytic routes and looking at approaches to recycle and upcycle not only bio-based materials, but also petroleum-derived components as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Epps. We should move on now to, that was the sort of introduction to the bio-based from an academic perspective and the innovation that's happening around this area. And let's now move to the industrial sector. And I'm pleased to introduce, if I can get my slide to go. I'm pleased to introduce Mike Salzberg, who is the Global Business Director for DuPont, and I will let Mike speak about his accomplishments and his introduction. He can do a much better job than I can, I guess.
Oh, thanks, Professor Ryan. Appreciate the introduction. Again, I lead DuPont's business in biomaterials. And again, when we say biomaterials, we mean materials made from renewable resources. I've been there for about 33 years. I've been leading the biomaterials space at DuPont for almost 15 years. Our business today, we have two commercial businesses that we make a chemical called Bio-PDO. I'll show you on the next chart what that is in Loudon, Tennessee. And we use that chemical to make a polymer called Sorona. And we make that polymer in Kinston, North Carolina. And obviously we're proud to be headquartered in Delaware. So we employ people and do innovation in 3 different states here in the United States. In addition to our commercial-based products, we're also developing new materials. Some of them are replacement of existing materials. In other words, making existing materials by a better process. And some of them are new materials like our Sorona and Bio-PDO, which replace old-fashioned petro-based materials like nylon or polyester. When we look at materials, the way we think about it is we have 3 major criteria for when we design or kick off a new research project. So one very important thing for us is that the overall life cycle, the overall impact on the environment for anything that we develop in the biomaterials business has to be significantly better than whatever materials it replaces. The other thing that's very important for us is that the performance of these materials has to be high enough that they'll be acceptable by consumers and by brands. One of the challenges when you bring a new material to market is there's always some great new materials, great existing materials that are out there. You've got to make sure that the performance of your material can be sufficient that a consumer is interested in it and they'll use it. And then finally, having a scalable supply and a cost that makes sense is what's required in order to make these materials accessible and affordable to a large piece of the market. So that combination of cost performance, technical performance, and environmental performance, we look for products that meet all 3 of those sets of criteria. We call that the sweet spot. And in our history, we've come up with the 2 commercial businesses, Bio-PDO and Sorona, and we've also got a couple of things in the pipeline that we're going to commercialize quite soon. If you would go to the next chart, please, Professor. I'll show you one of them. This is the Bio-PDO we talked about. The brand name is Sustera. It's a chemical that can replace petroleum-based propylene glycol and other kinds of chemicals in lots of different applications. For example, shoe soles, polyurethanes for shoe soles, or coatings, or inks, or hydraulic fluids. And one thing I did want to mention is this product has received many years ago. We've been commercial here for about 14 years. The USDA certified bio-based product certification. We really do appreciate that support from the government. It's helpful. I think during this panel, we'll talk about some other areas that we could use some help from the federal government in growing this industry. One more chart I have, I believe there's one more, right, Professor?
Yes, yeah.
This talks about how we can use the product Zemea, again, a Bio-PDO derivative in products like personal care. So if you're looking at some of the hand creams and the dishwashing detergent from Method, all these kind of companies, very often they're using our plant-based chemicals to replace petro-based chemicals in those formulations. That's a lot of what we're doing. The other one that You saw earlier on the pictures of Sorona. Sorona is a fantastic polymer. It's used to make the best carpet in the world called Smart Strand from Mohawk. It's used in lots of different kinds of apparel. It provides a lot of technical benefits as well as environmental benefits. So I'm very pleased to be here today and look forward to our discussion. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you. And this also is, as I understand it from your slide, that it's a USDA certified bio-based product, which is a part of the USDA's bio-preferred program that was part of the Farm Bill. So just a side note to that. We will move from the beginning of life bio-based carbon type products to a combination of bio-based and what happens at the end of life. So we will now introduce Dr. Bob Powell, CEO and founder. Bob started Brightmark, and I will let Bob talk a little bit about what has been done in the end of life part. And I have 2 slides of yours, Bob, which talks about Bioplastics as well, so we can address that. Bob?
Sure, and thank you very much. I did not get my doctorate, but I appreciate the promotion and degree there.
Honorary Dr. Bob Powell. Okay.
Thank you very much. We'll hold judgment until the end of the session here. So again, yes, I'm Bob Powell. I'm the CEO and founder here at Brightmark, and at Brightmark, we actually take the theoretical and make it very practical. And so what our mission is to reimagine waste. And we do that by creating circular solutions that eliminate waste and reuse our resources. So eliminate waste. Part of what we do is divert plastic from landfills and waterways. We also capture methane, not the subject of this particular discussion, but we are involved in renewable natural gas projects that do that. And then we reuse our resources by taking post-use plastics and converting them into usable products like diesel fuels, waxes, and then actually the materials to remake and reuse back into plastics. And certainly I mentioned the RNG part from a reuse of resources standpoint. And then we also create fertilizers and clean waters out of the RNG projects. Now, as it relates to what we do in the post-use plastics area, we do utilize a technology that is known as pyrolysis, which has been around for a while. But what has not been around for a while was the way to take pyrolysis to convert post-use plastics at a production scale that can take all of the plastics to reuse them. Our technology was invented 15 years ago, and we started a year ago in April with the first of its kind production scale economic facility in its first phase that will be fully completed by the first quarter of 21. And we're actually creating usable products as we speak right now there. It's located in the state of Indiana, Northeast Indiana, in the town of Ashley. First phase is designed to take 100,000 tons of plastics and convert it into the usable products that you can see here on the slide as well. 18 million gallons of the fuels and 6 million gallons of waxes. It's 93% efficient. Again, we can take all the plastics, the 1 through 7 plastics. Most typically what we see are a subset, but a large subset, the roughly 80% of plastics that are thrown away and not used either through mechanical recycling or through incineration, which we're not a big fan of, to create other forms of energy. So we take what's left over, the 80% that is not reused. Our process when we create fuels is 14% better from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint. And ultimately, as we complete Ashley and construct other projects, we have the ability to create roughly 70 to 80% of our content back into plastics. So extremely excited about the circularity around that. We do think that there are multiple approaches to dealing with the post-use plastics issue. Certainly waste reduction, I think, is very important, and we support that as well. And then there are alternatives, some of which are economic, some of which are not, and then reuse, which is what we offer as well. So that is the mission that we're on with respect to post-use plastics. I'm happy to talk very briefly, Professor, on a couple of the other slides. I don't want to take away from others' presentations, but
Yeah.
what?
Now, just let me give some context to the other two because it fits in well. Number one, to the attendees, there is a question and answer icon which is on your screens. Feel free to ask questions as you listen to the various intros and know about them. And two, they can be anonymous, so you don't have to tell who you are and where you're from. So please make use of it. It will be useful, and ask your questions. So that will go into Q&A, and we can therefore pick it up. One of the questions, Bob, which came up, which fits in very well with what you have to speak on it, has to do with the fact that the attendee asked the following question. He says, UK organizations called for degradable plastic ban. And what do you know? Because what do you suggest about plastics? And do you have any comments on this? And I can let you speak, and then when we get to the others, they can have their own comments as well. But it's a very good question, an important question about ban degradable plastics.
Sure, and there may be other experts on the degradable plastics. And I think when you hear me talk about our solution, we realize there are other solutions. And I think there certainly is a place for degradable plastics in some applications. What we do have to realize that when plastics that are degradable, in fact, do degrade, they create different forms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I think one of the bigger picture views that we must have when we look at either plastics or alternatives is what are the consequences of making those decisions. So I fully support other alternatives. Just realize as they degrade, they create greenhouse gas emissions as well. And we're here to help solve that too. Listen, I think many of us know, to the next slide here, why plastics are quite useful. They make food waste, they eliminate from a tremendous perspective. You can see the one example we have here. Cars are lighter weight and are more fuel efficient as a result of plastics. There are other applications that we use quite often, such as car seats for our young children that are hard to replicate with other types of materials. So plastics do a lot of good things, and I would include medical applications, hospitals, et cetera. So we think that part of the solution is not necessarily to ban all of them, but to figure out a better way to reuse. In fact, if you'll go to the next slide, Professor.
Just a minute. That's your next slide up there.
Yeah. So again, I think I get back to the point of when we look at alternatives, some alternatives I think absolutely will work, but let's just make sure we consider them. So some of the more common alternatives to plastics, types of metals, glasses, even papers, have a greater impact on the environment. The biggest driver in terms of the reason why alternatives to plastics have a greater impact on the environment and cost is the weight of the materials. One of the beautiful things about plastics is they're lightweight and durable. So most of the common or the more common alternatives to plastics weigh generally 4 times on a per unit basis. And so the weight, the transportation, et cetera, associated with the alternatives are what create the types of costs that we talk about here. So I think for me, that was what I wanted to share with the folks here. Happy to answer any other questions. And there may be other panelists that wish to speak.
Yes. We will hold, there are several questions. Please have your Q&A coming up. What I'd like to mix this up with just presentation. So on the subject of the plastics ban and on the single-use plastics, we will come back to it. And as the other panel members come up, we can have them address that as well. And then we will come back to Professor Epps and Professor Corley to give their viewpoint on how this is being addressed. So let's move on to the next panelist intro, and pleased to introduce Phil Van Trump, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Danimer Scientific, and have him introduce the company and what they do. Phil?
Thanks, Professor.
Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Narayan. So I'm Phil Van Trump, the Chief Science and Technology Officer for Danimer, and I lead our research and development efforts. So Danimer Scientific's a performance polymer company, and we specialize in bioplastic replacements for traditional petroleum-based plastics. So we bring together innovative technologies to deliver renewable and environmentally friendly bioplastic materials to our global consumer customer base. We employ approximately 170 teammates in Georgia and Kentucky, Georgia being the home to our headquarters, research facilities, demonstration plant, and extrusion manufacturing, and Kentucky being home to our commercial PHA plant. We produce polyhydroxyalkanoates, a big mouthful, or PHAs, which is a biodegradable plastic alternative sold under our Nodax brand name. These materials are used in a wide variety of plastic applications, including films, straws, food containers, among other items. PHAs are produced through a fermentation process utilizing vegetable oils, which is a renewable feedstock. PHA can be a complete replacement for many of the common petroleum-based plastics used today, specifically in single-use plastics applications, as an example. And PHAs offer a definitive end of life in a very short time frame compared to traditional petro-based plastics through biodegradability. Utilizing these PHAs as a base resin that can be used with other biopolymers that are degradable as well, significantly increases the potential applications for biopolymers in general. And then it allows us to produce not only materials that are industrial compostable, but also biodegradable in other environments, such as home compost, soil, freshwater, and marine. In addition to end of life, PHAs can be recycled as well when there's enough of the materials in the system to gather. It offers an alternative end of life for managing waste, including industrial and home compost, as well as anaerobic digestion. So, besides going to the landfill and incinerators for a direct management of the materials. So we all know that many plastic articles are difficult to recycle or not recycled at all, and biodegradability can be a mechanism where these materials are essentially recycled by nature. Materials such as films and fibers, which are complex structures, many different materials, and frequently soiled with food and other waste, makes it very difficult for these materials to be recycled. And having a degradable material offers an excellent alternative to deal with these materials after they've been used. If PHAs end up in the environment, it's not managed. It offers an additional end of life where they won't persist in the environment due to their biodegradability. So thank you very much for your time, and back to you, Professor Narayan.
Professor, you're on mute, I believe.
Professor, you're on mute.
Yep, thank you. So we will move on to the next, keep the Q&As going. There are several questions and I promise to compile it and get back to the panelists to address. We will move to the next panel member. This is Derek Atkinson from Corbion Total. And Derek, the floor is yours to talk about the issue.
Thank you, Professor Narayan. This is a little overview of my background. Interestingly, I work for Total Corbion PLA. Our US entity is registered in Delaware, so there's a connection there. And I worked for 12 years, or nearly 20 years for W.R. Grace Davison. And DuPont is the oldest continually operating chemical company in the US. And Davison Chemical was the second oldest continually operating chemical company in the US. We are involved with Plastics Industry Association, and I am a member of the board of the Biodegradable Products Institute, who are concerned with the biodegradability of all materials, such as not just plastics, but also paper. Total Corbion is a global producer of polylactic acid. Polylactic acid is one of the major bioplastics that are in use today. We started up a plant 2 years ago, 165 million pounds, and we announced a month ago that we will be building a second plant, which will be 200 million pounds, which will mean that we are the largest PLA producer in the world. Do you want to go to the next slide, Professor Narayan?
Yep, just a minute.
So this is an overview about PLA, but it goes to all biomaterials, bioplastics. It was produced by the Plastics Industry Association. So in terms of PLA, carbon dioxide and oxygen are removed from the atmosphere by plants in a process called photosynthesis. This creates carbohydrates. These can be cane sugar, it could be beet sugar, it could be corn, it could be wheat, it could be a range of products. Those carbohydrates are then converted into lactic acid. This is a fermentation process. So much as you can produce ethanol from corn, you can also produce lactic acid from corn. Corbion is the world's largest producer of lactic acid and has a plant in Nebraska, amongst other places. That lactic acid is then polymerized to make polylactic acid, which is a polymer, which we make. We then sell that to companies that then convert that into a product. So an example here is a cold cup, and there are many producers in the US of these cold cups. This is then sold to an event perhaps, and someone buys it, fills it with beer, and then drinks it, and then decides they want to get rid of it. And there are different alternatives for that. You can incinerate it and recover the energy as one method of the end of life. You can mechanically recycle it. So much as you would mechanically recycle PET, you can do the same with PLA. So you can take the PLA and you can regrind it, you can remelt it, and you can make the product again. As with PET, there's a number of times that you can do that before the product quality is not sufficient for you to continue doing it. Alternatively, you can industrially compost it. So PLA is industrial compostable. It will go back to carbon dioxide and water under certain conditions. As Phil mentioned previously, one of the major benefits of this compostability is not just the end-of-life solution for the product itself, but what the product might contain. So one of the big problems with the environment today is the amount of food that gets sent to landfill. Having packaging that is contaminated with food, that has to go to landfill. It cannot be recycled. If you have composting as the end-of-life solution, you can send the contaminated plastic to an industrial composter, and the food that is contained in there will be processed in a way that is helpful to the environment. Finally, because something like PLA is industrially compostable, the conditions in an industrial composter are pretty benign. What happens in the composter is it effectively depolymerizes the PLA back to lactic acid, and organisms eat the lactic acid. That means that the conditions to take it back to lactic acid are very low temperature, low pressure conditions. So we can actually take the material back to lactic acid in effectively a hot bath. You can stick the material into hot water and it will go back to lactic acid. We can purify the lactic acid and we can repolymerize it and make virgin material again with a minimal loss of the carbon that was there in the original material. Hopefully that was a little overview. If I could perhaps make a little comment about the question that was asked earlier. The UK ban, you can probably tell I'm from the UK, so I have some awareness of this. The UK British standards introduced a new standard that facilitated the use of oxodegradables. Oxodegradable additives cause things like polyethylene to break down, but into small pieces that create microplastics. These additives are going to be banned in the EU in a couple of years' time. And people in the UK were very concerned that this new standard was facilitating the use of additives that would be effectively banned elsewhere in Europe. And so a load of brand owners and chemical producers and supermarkets, etc., wrote a joint letter asking that the BS rescind the standard that they just produced on the 1st of October.
Thank you, Derek. That was useful information and pertinent to what we were discussing. I want to take this opportunity to again note that many of you are putting your questions into the Q&A box. There were two who do not use the chat function because then it doesn't get recorded. So put it in the Q&A box. Panelists can answer the questions directly there, and you can post it. That would be a very effective way in which you can communicate. Any of the panelists can answer the questions. And what we will do is we will collect the Q&A if it is not answered and get you answers, and that Q&A will become a part of the record of this briefing document. So please continue to put your Q&A, and that's how we plan to make this as interactive as possible. And there are some great questions. We'll start to try and address one as we move along, but certainly encourage sending in your questions. So let's move on. And I want to introduce Dave Kettner from Virent. This is more towards the end of life technologies. And Dave, can you take over?
Great. Thank you, Professor. You can go to the next slide. So my name is Dave Kettner. I'm the president of Virent Inc. We are an early stage company based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and founded on technology developed at the University of Wisconsin. And really what we're working on today is to commercialize our process for taking carbohydrates from plants and being able to convert them into drop-in products that can be utilized not only in the transportation sector, but also to provide 100% renewable and recyclable plastics. Go to the next slide, please. And we're doing this through several different partnerships with a number of different parties, including our parent Marathon Petroleum Corporation. But really what the main story here is that we have a technology that can take biogenic carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into better uses. And this is a 100% replacement for petroleum-based products. And if you look on this slide, you'll notice that what we've been able to do with our technology to date is to be able to utilize that to demonstrate a qualified gasoline fuel, jet fuel, as well as in regards to this presentation, 100% renewable plastics. And these plastics, in essence, if you can go to the next slide, are drop-in plastics, or at least drop-in material that goes into the current production system within the United States and across the world to produce renewable plastics. And Professor, if you can go one more, I think. So our process itself drops directly into the current infrastructure. So as referenced earlier by DuPont, and they're producing products that utilize ethylene glycol to provide 30% of the product that goes into plastics. We provide the remaining 70%. And through our process then, we are looking at being able to impact significantly the plastic space by providing 100% renewable plastics. Now, these plastics are no different than what you find today, other than if you did carbon dating, it would be less than 100 years old as opposed to millions of years old as you get with fossil products. And in addition to the PET, we also provide the necessary products that go into hardened plastics that you can find in computers, as well as other materials of use today. And so one of the questions that came up is, online is there a point in time that bioplastics are or will become unsustainable if left unchecked? Well, in this instance, when you look at our technology, certainly what we're doing is we're trying to take the biogenic carbon out of the atmosphere. So your carbon source is not coming from below the ground, it's coming from above the ground. And this is where we would like to advocate for qualified and quality practices and regulations put in place that allow us to go ahead, utilize that biogenic carbon in a safe and sustainable manner, working with the agricultural industry so that we can have a positive impact on the world. Professor, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. And then we move on. I have, this is not necessarily put last, but it's more based on the innovation that it provides. It's a synthetic biology application, and Helgi Zieler, who's the founder and president, can you take the floor and inform us on this new technology and what it can do to end of life?
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Narayan. My name is Helgi Zieler. I'm founder and president of Primordial Genetics. As the professor mentioned, we're a synthetic biology company. So this is a little bit of a different space and approach from the other companies that have presented. We essentially use modern genetic and biological tools to improve microbes and enzymes. And these are biological work units that are used heavily and extensively in our economies. And so our genetic technology, which we call function generator, allows us to make very dramatic improvements to these biological organisms and catalysts and create utility across a number of industries. While our commercial focus is in areas, biomanufacturing areas outside of plastics, specifically DNA and RNA manufacturing, which I will not cover today, we have had a project in enzymatic plastic degradation, which is relevant to today's discussion. And so a brief introduction to enzymatic plastic degradation. It turns out that enzymes, which are the catalysts of the biological world, and that means that they enable all the transformations of chemicals and nutrients in our bodies and our tissues. So enzymes can be adapted and evolved to be useful to break down materials, polymers like plastics. And modern synthetic biology methods especially can accelerate the development of enzymes that can degrade plastics. And these could be bioplastics, or it could be plastics derived from petroleum feedstocks. And so a number of organizations, we've been working with funds from the Department of Energy and collaborating with the National Renewable Energy Lab, a national lab in Golden, Colorado, to accelerate development of such enzymes. So what this means for plastic degrading process, these enzymes cleave bonds very selectively. And they can essentially convert a solid structure like a plastic back into the monomeric components that can be used to make new virgin plastics. So rather than recycling mechanically or chemically, which often means downcycling, we in principle restore the chemical components that are used to make new plastics. So there is no change in the quality and property of the plastic involved. Now this technology has been demonstrated on a number of plastics, including polyurethane, polyethylene terephthalate, PET, and nylons. But it's in early stages of development because, as you can imagine, for very tough materials like this plastic bottle, which is fortunately half blocked by Zoom, the enzyme has to get in there somehow. It has to help solubilize that solid structure and pull it apart and degrade it. That turns out to be difficult. However, the tools that we have at our disposal, biological tools, synthetic biology tools, are well understood. There's sort of a clean path mapped out for achieving these optimizations of the enzymes that can result in commercial processes. And an enzymatic process has the great advantage that it uses very mild conditions to achieve plastic breakdown. So in aqueous or in a water-based environment with low temperatures, meaning very low energy input, you can in principle break down a plastic completely into its components. So we are among the companies and organizations in this space who are hoping that with appropriate federal investment, this space can be accelerated. The Department of Energy is already very active in this space, but this is an area of great challenge, and government funding will certainly accelerate the development of this promising technology.
Very good. Thank you all very much, and appreciate that. I have stopped screen share, so hopefully you can see the profiles of all our panelists. And it is on my screen complete, so hopefully it's on yours. And I would like to begin the Q&A type. There are about many questions in there. I'll pick one, but let me start with the fundamental issue on plastics bans, and because and talk about alternate materials. So I like to start with the academic biased maybe because I'm an academic, but I'll start with Professor Corley and Professor Ibbs to talk about plastics ban. Does that make sense? Does it not make sense? And does the innovations, which is now being advanced through the Center for Innovation, but companies, would that mitigate that? And what are your thoughts and comments on it? So I'll start first with Professor Corley.
Sure. So I'll just start by saying that I think in addressing this issue, whether it's a ban or other policies that are in place, I think it's important that just like this briefing has a variety of different constituents and stakeholders in this process, it's important for us to talk, right? I think the integration and the network between the academic and the industrial national lab partners, policy folks, is extremely important for us to start thinking about this, right? So for example, in our current climate, single-use plastics have become a priority, right, for healthcare, for health reasons, right? So we have to start thinking about what do we do, how do we mitigate, but really helping us think about the, as you described, this kind of life cycle, cradle to grave context of the plastics, right? So one of the things that I think from an academic standpoint is us being able to provide a perspective of what are some additional strategies that we can implement in this particular case, right? What are ways we can start to help people think about not just bans, but how do we change lifestyles? How do we change use? Can we create plastics that have multiple uses, right? And so that's the whole upcycling strategy. I think it's going to take a variety of different partnerships to really be able to address this.
Thank you. And Professor Ibbs, you want to add to that?
The only thing that I'll add is just expanding a little bit on some of the comments around the utility of single-use plastics. So for example, when you think about the current situation with the pandemic and you look at vaccine production, that's one of the things where in a lot of cases these days, there's single-use plastics that's used throughout that process. And there's some unintended potential consequences if we consider just a blanket ban without necessarily, as Professor Corley mentioned, talking to the various stakeholders. And also I think it's important to think about, as one or two of the other panelists mentioned, that the definition of plastics is also a very important thing to consider. And so making sure that people are informed about what they're really banning when they say we want to ban plastics or single-use plastics is, I think, a very important educational consideration as well.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that's some answers that help us move forward. Mike, DuPont's bio-based polymers, what is the vision for the end of life of these polymers?
Yeah, so it's a great question. When you mentioned earlier on that both the beginning of life and the end of life matter. So we've heard during the comments that have been made so far, there's a lot of ways to address end of life. You can recycle, you can compost, you can incinerate or capture the energy from plastics. All those things also interact with what kind of carbon we're talking about. So to the extent we use plant-based carbon that was pulled out of the atmosphere, biogenic carbon, as we heard from one of the panelists, if that material is then, for example, composted or burned, it gets returned back to the atmosphere. But as long as it started from plant-based, it doesn't add anything to global warming. So one whole set of solutions, whether it's composting or energy recovery, is much better served with bio-based plastics that pull the carbon out of the atmosphere into a plant than they are petro-based. So that's one important point, I think, is to put those things together. What we do at DuPont is whenever we come out with a new material, we have in mind what the end of use will be. So Sorona, for example, is in the polyester family. Polyesters are quite recyclable. They're also amenable, hopefully, to some of the enzymatic breakdown solutions that people are beginning to develop. So that's pretty much been our focus. We haven't focused so much on compostable. We focus more on durable products that are recyclable. And then again, because they're bio-based, if they are used in an energy recovery scenario, they don't contribute to global warming.
Thank you, Michael. Dave, from a Virent perspective, at what scale are you? I thought I gathered from your presentation that one of the monomers you're looking for is terephthalic acid and trying to feed back into the PET cycle. Can you comment on what scale, where you are in this process, and is there any connectivity to the end customers who will utilize that monomer in their products? Can you?
Yeah, Professor, thank you for the question. So Virent, currently we're at demonstration scale in the sense that we've produced today over 11 tons of Bio-Paraxylene. And that Bio-Paraxylene itself would be converted into PTA and then combined with methyl, with ethylene glycol to produce, PET. And that PET could be in the plastic bottles, could be in polyester, which is, worn today in apparel, in carpet, and other applications, as well as to other films and applications in product packaging. And so when you start looking at where our position is, ultimately where we want to get into commercial scale, this is where, support from, the Delaware delegation and other different government entities can help companies like ours move from the demonstration scale into the commercial scale and really kind of get through what's called the proverbial, valley of death. And that's in the sense of where you've got a great technology. Granted, yes, I'm a little biased, towards us, but I think our technology can make a significant difference in play in this space from a bioplastic standpoint. But that's where, I would charge the Delaware delegation to look at ways that we can go ahead and support new technologies to get to commercial scale. So then when we do get to commercial scale, which now we're talking about plants upwards of 300,000 kilotons per year up to even 1 million kilotons per year, being able to produce quantities of the raw materials that go into plastics that can make a significant difference. And the last point that I would make is, especially when we start looking at the United States, and as we've come through the COVID and the interest of making product here at home, we have a significant amount of assets within the United States, which are starting to be outsized by some of the large plastic producers in Asia and other parts of the world. And this is a great opportunity for us to be able to look at how can we, combine agriculture with the chemical industry, and be able to start making a lot of these products at home, converting some of these US-based assets, which are smaller and probably won't be competitive on the international side, but let's convert them into 100% renewable bio-based facilities and make this a US industry that's going to be certainly dominant throughout the rest of the world. Again, when you look at our biological resources, the assets that we currently have in place, the innovative technologies coming out of different universities and different companies, there's no reason why we can't become a leader in this place.
Great, thank you, Dave. I'll switch now to the bio-based compostable products, and Phil, this is to you. PHA certainly is a unique polymer, and you not only offer PHA, but you offer total solutions, right? Depending on what the application is. Can you provide some examples of where you are being successful in this space? Some partnerships which you can share and say how this concept of is being taken forward.
Yeah, as Mike noted from DuPont earlier, you really have to think about the whole, application development product life cycle, and really focus not only on the molecules and the materials themselves, but bring the materials forward into applications that meet the performance requirements and also meet the end of life requirements that the customers have as well. So, in order to that, it takes a village. So, we have lots of polymer and PHA folks, but we also need partners such as brand owners in order to help develop applications, because they understand it exactly what they need. So we have a number of partnerships such as PepsiCo and Nestle, and one of the applications would be multi-layer barrier packaging. So when you think about materials that are highly engineered, you have multiple layers for barrier and performance requirements to get the shelf life and the preservation part of the materials that you noted earlier. You have to engineer all those things. So the unique part about doing that, you come up with a degradable solution, whether that be industrial compost or other, is that now you have a alternative end of life where nature recycles those materials that would otherwise make them uneconomical or very difficult to recycle when you think about very thin materials that have different polymers for different purposes. So reimagining and re-engineering these materials through partnerships in order to make the world a better place is it is highly successful. And my colleagues here on the call today all have similar examples of solutions that they're bringing forward as well.
Thank you, Phil. Derek, on the same topic, just getting you ready for keying you for this is, in order for these products to be successful, and this is a question which was in the Q&A panel, composting infrastructures need to develop, and the tie-in has to be there. Where do you see the industry, the compostable plastics industry there? And can you address some of the critiques against the compostable plastics, and what can, since this is a congressional briefing, what do you think is needed to get this area going forward, specifically related to packaging with food waste and the composting, that kind of a cycle around it? So hopefully you can address that.
So the plastics themselves, composting as an end-of-life solution is generally not the best end-of-life solution. It's far better to recycle materials than to compost them. Where composting is important is with the diversion of food waste from landfill. Biodegradable plastics can really facilitate that in a huge way. The question then comes, what about contamination of the compost? So PLA and other compostable plastics and papers do not contaminate, but non-biodegradable materials do have the capability to contaminate. So the biggest issue is, how do we ensure that the person in the home is disposing of the waste in the most appropriate manner? So labeling the plastic packaging so that it's understood that yes, that goes to composting, or this one goes to recycling. Once that's been settled, then it's important that there is sufficient collection of the waste, so there is sufficient amount that's available, and then there are sufficient facilities to compost the waste. The level of contamination, if you like, or the level of bioplastics that can be in the compost without causing any problems is greater than 10%. So you can get a significant amount of these biodegradable plastics within the food waste, and it doesn't really cause a problem. So the biggest constraints are acceptability of compostable materials by the composters, having sufficient composting facilities available, and having sufficient collection of the composting. So the big driver going forward for composters is food waste, not garden waste. It is food waste is the problem that needs to be solved, and infrastructure needs to be in place to be able to collect and to deal with that.
Thank you, Derek. Bob, the technology which you are proposing really doesn't, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but doesn't differentiate whether it is a bioplastic, a regular plastic, a compostable plastics, because ultimately you're going to take it down to a naphtha-like product which you can then recycle. Is that correct? Or can you tell me more about that aspect of it?
That would be correct if the forms of plastics that we're taking in look like the more traditional ones. When you have biodegradable materials, sometimes it will deviate from a traditional sort of set of chains, and you and a few others are more expert at the hydrocarbon chains and the exact bonds, but it really does not matter in our technology what the source was that created the plastic, so long as they look sort of in that typical 1 through 7 type of classification system.
Great. My quick question, there was this on the Q&A box, which I thought was very intriguing, was 1 kg of your waste. How much of naphtha will that give you in your process today, right? You have a plant and you're doing this. Can you give some numbers on that? I think that was the right question.
Yeah. Boy, I would have to do some quick math in my head. Okay, so we're 93% efficient, but that includes both the liquid stream and then the non-condensable gas stream. Of the liquid stream, there are, right around 40% of our liquid stream is that naphtha stream. So I'd probably need to, you know what, if somebody wants to know that, fine to do that. I think the best way to do it would allow me to get my calculator out here and shoot me an email.
Oh, that's fine, Bob. I put you on a much tighter position than anybody else. I ask you very specific. but we can always get back and we'll include it. I reserved this, Helgi, for the last, and this is from me. And there's another question in the Q&A which addresses this. We hear a lot about enzymes and microorganisms and modified, and that they are a solution to take PET, for example, that you can break it down to terephthalic acid and glycol. There are examples being cited of urethanes being broken down. You mentioned it too. And the question is, do you really think that the rates and breakdown is scalable today? It seems like, what are the yields in this? And that's one part. The B part is, if you're going to incorporate these organisms or enzymes into a product to allow for breakdown later, have you been able to, or can you think about generating these enzymes that can withstand plastics processing temperatures of 180 Celsius? Because that's what typically will be needed. So go ahead and address it as you see fit.
Yeah, no, great questions, Professor. So first question, are there scalable processes available right now? The answer is no. The honest answer is no. So while it's been demonstrated with PET that you can get complete breakdown, enzymatic breakdown under the right conditions, this was done with what's called amorphous PET. So it was specially prepared to be non-crystalline, that's more accessible to the enzymes. And so the industry does need to make progress to get the crystalline plastics, get the enzymes into the crystalline plastics, and that's additional steps in enzyme evolution, potentially also in working with plastics manufacturers to formulate them the right way. However, just the last few years have made tremendous progress. And I would also say in the case of polyurethanes, where a lot of the polyurethanes produced are foams, so they inherently have perfect properties for enzymatic degradation. High surface area, so a low degree of crystallinity, so high degree of accessibility of the polymer to an external agent. And polyurethanes actually degrade faster than PET in natural environments. So that bodes well for creating an enzymatic process for degrading polyurethanes. So I believe that this is 5 to 10 years away with appropriate funding, and the process has to be economical. That means the companies that develop these have to, with all their calculations, realize that they can make substantial profit in producing such a system. And that's where government incentives and regulations can help a lot.
Helgi, the more important question was temperature. Do you see enzymes not denaturing at these processing temperatures? What's your comment on that?
No, I mean, realistically not, Professor, but I think what's being contemplated is adding these enzymes to the plastic after the fact, so not during manufacturing, but having an enzymatic process where as the plastic is collected and shredded and processed, then the enzyme is added and then it degrades it. And that would certainly be feasible. That can then preserve the enzyme's structure. But I don't see currently with PET, being a really harsh production process, I don't see that enabling the enzyme to be incorporated into the plastic.
Okay, good. That was a very, thank you for putting it in the right place about the enzyme.
Sometimes you have to be honest, some things are not possible, yeah.
Yeah, and that goes back to either Professor Corley or Ipsy, and I think Professor Corley, you said that is one of the research efforts within the center to look at enzymatic depolymerizations and how to go about it and how to structure it. That links directly to that. Do you want to comment on that then?
Sure. I'll just say that we have efforts where we're interested in taking plastics waste and inserting heteroatoms to create functional material systems, right? So being able to utilize that for surfaces, and then partnering with, as Professor Epps mentioned, some of the bio derived material systems, being able to partner with that to create a more sustainable, kind of life cycle managed products from those aspects.
Professor Epps, you have anything to add to that, or?
Just something maybe a little bit to the overall discussion. I think that one of the things that I know Derek pointed out a little bit that I'd like to just reemphasize is that there's not necessarily always there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution when you think about the plastics waste. So there's opportunities and macromolecules that are more ideal for enzymatic degradation. There are things that may be compostable and things that like polyolefins, for example, that would be more amenable to things like pyrolysis, et cetera. I think one of the things that we do have to consider, though, when you think about some of these, if we're calling them renewable and sustainable solutions, things like energy content and energy input matters. And that is one thing to consider when we start looking at these processes. And what that also relates to is education. And so I'll just give one example. Sometimes people use incineration and pyrolysis as synonyms, and they're actually extremely opposite processes, both from an energy input-output standpoint, as well as then an environmental pollution standpoint. But I think that when we look at some of the legislation, they've been sort of conflated together. So I think that's where industry and academia can work to better educate folks on what the options really are.
Great, thank you.
I agree
Go ahead,
with
Bob.
that. Yeah, if I may. That's a really good comment. And I think we need to be very careful when we use these terms. So you heard me say, and listen, we use pyrolysis as our primary technology on the plastic side. You also heard me say that of the 20% that's reused, there's a significant portion, about 11%, that is incinerated. That is not what pyrolysis is. We actually don't use oxygen in the process. There are very few emissions associated with that. And the energy input of that relative to other processes are much lower. There are other similar comparisons we need to make, but I think the point is exactly right. We need to make sure we understand what we're talking about and not make policy decisions based on just a broad brush approach to the different solutions. They're not all created equal.
Great. This is a question which probably arises. I address this quite a bit, and this has got to do with biodegradability. Are we using the wrong terminology? I'm sure we're never going to get rid of it, but you don't want something to degrade and be in the environment, but you want to ensure that they are completely removed from the environment, right? Which is complete microbial utilization. But then there are products out there which is confusing and misleading. What can you suggest to be done? And I will start with a I know that both Phil and Derek can answer it because their products are certified and compostable and all that, and PHAs has got certain biodegradability characteristics. But I'll ask Michael, because DuPont has not stepped into this whole compostable biodegradable space. You have stayed with bio-based plastics. Is there concern? And what's your feelings? What is DuPont's view on this aspect?
Yeah, so I can't say DuPont's view. I can say my view. Big company, right? So I think Derek made a very good point earlier on, which is there's not one size fits all. So for example, if you're talking about food waste, we have things all mixed together. Composting makes a ton of sense. If you're talking about mixed plastic, where it's very difficult for a municipality to collect things, frankly, energy recovery or incineration might make sense. And if you're in a situation where you can get a lot more of the value back, some of the technologies like pyrolysis or recycling can make a lot of sense. So I think you really do have to enable all of these. What I would say is, since we got the congressional staffers on the phone here, let me speak directly to you. If I could do one thing, if I could ask you to do one thing that will advance the innovation in this space, it would be the following. Look, the United States has the most efficient agriculture in the world. we should be leading the world in bio-based materials, right? And the reason it's gone slowly is very simple. Right now, petro-based plastics are cheaper than they should be. And that's because oil companies, natural gas companies can pump the stuff out of the ground, and then it gets used, it goes out into the environment, and somebody else pays for cleaning it up, somebody else pays for recycling it, somebody else pays for it. So they're artificially cheap. And so in my opinion, if we go and do bans or try to pick winners, it's very difficult to do. What I would love to see Congress do is unleash all the innovation you're hearing today from academics, from companies large and small, unleash it. And the way to do that is to make petro-based plastics as expensive as they should be based on their impact on the environment. So a carbon tax, there's lots of different people, there's different groups out there that have, great ideas. If you do that, if you can raise the value of these plastics, it will mean that people like Phil and Helga, all these different technologies that we've heard today become much more competitive. You'll unleash the creativity. And frankly, the US ought to be leading the world in bio-based materials because we have the best agriculture sector. It creates jobs in agriculture as well as in industry. If we could make it a level playing field, stop subsidizing petro-based plastics, and even put a tax on them so that the real cost of them is shown in the marketplace, you will unleash all of these different innovations that you're hearing today, whether it's recycling, biodegradable or compostable plastics, all these different technologies, pyrolysis, everything will be enabled by making petro-based plastics as
Michael, Mike, just a quick interjection on that. Can you comment on the fact that we do have something like this on the books, right? The USDA Biopreferred program was supposed to do this, right? It is part of congressional law for procurement and all. But can you comment that has there been much activity on that from your company perspective, from Phil, from Derek, from the producers? Is there a pull from, which is what it was supposed to do? Can you comment on that? Because it seems like there is legislation and there is this activity existing, but it doesn't seem to have pushed the industry forward.
Yeah, again, I think it was very well-intentioned legislation. It works on the back end. In other words, it works at to try to create demand for plastics. But again, what ends up happening is if you're a procurement guy at an Army base and you buy a carpet, right? On the hand, hey, it would be great to buy a bio-based carpet. On the other hand, because petro-based plastics are so cheap, you also have to watch out for the taxpayer and not spend more money. So to me, that way doesn't work very well. And frankly, it's been a very well-intentioned program, had very little impact on our industry. What would really help, again, would be to raise the cost of petro-based plastics to reflect their actual cost to society. That'll unleash this innovation. That'll be way more effective than, for example, Biopreferred, which tries to create this artificial demand on the, all the way down at the end of the chain. Hasn't worked very well so far. That's why I really advocate for this sort of a carbon tax or carbon fee kind of approach.
Quick comment, Phil, short comments with Phil and Derek on this aspect of market, the USDA program. Has that helped your companies sell more to the government or not?
For companies such as Derek and ours, or Mike or any of the folks on the webinar today, the Biopreferred focuses more on the end product rather than our companies, which are more focused on the the upstream raw materials. So enabling and making sure all the way through the supply chain that the end customer who's turning, or the end retailer, if you will, that's actually making the final material to go to be sold and actually be listed in the Biopreferred program where they're buying the final article. There's a lot of steps in between our companies and the
Derek, can you simplify that?
That has to be and on the list. I don't know, Derek, if you've got some thoughts.
And I would concur with that. I would simply say that we're so far down the chain, it's very hard for us to measure. So we see no direct impact, but we don't know what impact our customers, how much of their sales are Biopreferred linked. and how much are not.
Very good. Helge, coming back to you then, do you see synthetic biology innovating to make designer enzymes, for example, or designer microorganisms that can be incorporated or can be a part of I wonder, can it be a part of the end of life infrastructure, whether it is composting or recycling or biodegradation? Do you see costs and viability, both technically and economically? What do you think will happen?
Absolutely, Professor Narayan. There have been a number of techno-economic analyses of enzymatic plastic degradation processes, and they all look very good, meaning the enzyme cost is not prohibitive because it does need to be produced and pure and then applied to the plastic. Enzyme costs not prohibitive, energy costs are very low, and assuming that there are appropriate collection waste streams, which, for example, for polyurethane are not quite in place yet, then this could be very viable. And there is a vibrant industry. The synthetic biology space is a vibrant young industry, mostly of small companies that are pioneering this and that are sort of carrying the flag, believing in the power of bioinnovation and biological conversions, bioproduction. Very, very varied projects. And this industry is not going away. It's been growing rapidly. There's been a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. So when Michael speaks about unleashing innovation, synthetic biology is that. That's what we stand for. So I'm a very strong believer in us being part of the solution, but we are also realistic. We don't think anything, existing infrastructure, existing methods and materials are not going to go away, and they shouldn't, because they're good materials and good industries. This is an add-on that will help clear up some of the post-consumer problems.
Great. And I want to, because we're coming up, Rena, I think we were coming up at 2:30, and that is the closure time for us, correct? And just send me a chat on that to make sure that's when we want to close. But Dave and then, of course, Bob, you are on the end of life of that part of it. And does it matter to you whether it is a bio-based plastic or it's a regular plastics? We'll still have a lot of legacy plastics on plastic. The technologies which you are developing can easily fit into that. Is the problem more in terms of economics, that virgin plastics, as I look at it, and this was alluded to by some of the panelists, is going to be more, Mike, you talked about that, if that is more expensive? I mean, if your product, after you collect the monomer and recycle, is more expensive than taking it from the refinery and simply making product, then this is never going to work. So since we have this as a congressional briefing, what would you suggest needs to happen? And Mike has said that. I just want you to chime in on what both of you think is needed to ensure that products made using your monomers or breakdown products will be used, even if it is 5-10% more expensive. How do you create that market pull? So Dave, and first you go, Dave, and then I'll let Bob comment on that.
So, for us, I mean, our technology will be providing a, virgin, 100% bio-based material. And Mike's correct in the sense that it's hard to compete with a very densified product in petroleum. Petroleum has been around for over 100 years, and they've had the luxury of improvements and efficiencies over time, to be able to squeeze every single dollar value out of that fossil. We are all new technologies, which means by definition, we're inherently going to be more expensive. But we also need to have the opportunity to build that first plant, build that second plant, third plant. And then, I think history would show is that over time, we're going to be competitive with what's out there in the market today. But I think the most important thing is to realize that, you know, renewable products are going to be specialty products for the short term. We are not a commodity product, and you are not going to be able to compete with commodity products. And so, you know, what we need to have is organizations, whether it's DuPont or even the, you know, B2C companies, those who are consumer facing, whether it's Nike, Adidas, go through all the apparel companies, go through all those companies which are providing, you know, plastics, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, you know, the list is endless. If you want to look at the pharmaceutical side, single-use plastics, right? You know, getting the pharmaceutical companies, the med tech companies, all to be looking at their sustainability initiatives and saying, hey, listen, we are willing to make that investment, pay a little bit more for this product, because that's what their shareholders are looking for. That's what their consumers are looking for. And I think collectively, when you start looking at that opportunity and that market pull and the interest in sustainability, you know, I think then that it drives everyone else along the supply chain, all the way down from the producers of virgin materials, recyclable products, and all the way to the B2C companies, to be willing to make that investment in the space. And then I think the last point that I would make to this is that when you actually look at the cost of the raw material that goes into, whether it's that shirt or that bottle, it is a small, small portion of the overall cost. It does fit within the margins though, but you know, that's where these companies have to make a decision. Am I going to charge 5 cents more for a bottle of Coca-Cola because it's 100% renewable based plastic, you know, and will the consumer pay for it? I personally think the consumer is going to be more than willing to pay for it, given in today's environment. And that's the message that we have to put out there, is that we need a fundamental shift. Consumers need to demand it. Corporate structures need to demand it. And I think with that collectively, you know, we can create the market pull that's going to allow us to get these technologies to market. Bob?
Okay, thanks, Dave. Just a couple short things. First off, I think Michael's exactly right. And I've said this for years, we've got a measurement issue. So I think if you really wanted sort of that in-game nirvanic way of doing this, when you bought that Coke bottle that Dave talked about, and one was made out of reused renewed plastics versus extracted from crude or methane out of the ground, the one that had a higher environmental footprint, all other things being equal, would cost you more. Not the reverse, which is you've got to pay more for something that's better for the environment. I think that's a longer term effort that we need to think about more broadly about how we solve. Now more practically. So my facility in Indiana, and I didn't think I would find it, it's quite possible I might not have, produces fuels. I don't really want to produce fuels. I want to remake plastics and create true circularity. But for us to and it does it economically, but for us to produce the highest proportion of materials, the polymers to remake plastics, there's additional investment, which is uneconomic currently for me, okay? It can be done, and it absolutely can. So the first company I ran was a renewable energy company. Really good model there. I think we've seen recently that renewable solar is now lower on a marginal cost basis than virtually other form of power production. How did it get there? There were incentives via the investment tax credit and the production tax credit, in addition to state REC programs, the California Solar Initiative in the state of California, that incented a good, but created an economic path ultimately where we now in renewable energy compete on par and frankly better than the dirtier forms of generation. So I think incenting good behaviors, I think governmental and private partnerships in those ways can drive down the technology costs so that ultimately we get to higher viability economic solutions. I really like that mechanism. We've done it in the States and in other countries. Okay. So I think we really should look there.
Thank you, Bob, for that. I am coming to the end of the panel, and the participants. You have been excellent in providing all the questions. We will make sure that the questions go to the various panelists, and we will summarize this in its entirety. And I have I just want to leave the last opportunity to my academic colleagues, both Professor Corley and Professor Ipps, to leave us with something to look forward to, and to in terms of bio-based, that is what I call the beginning of life, and B, the end of life, covering all the three, which is the recycling, the chemical depolymerization, as well as organic recycling or biodegradability, compostability. So if you could take just briefly and show us the vision for the future, then that would be great to end on that note. So Professor Corley, you go first.
Actually, I'll go ahead and start.
Oh, you should go first. Sorry, I should let Professor Corley be the last. Correct.
So one of the things that I guess I would say in terms of looking forward to the future is that actually then maybe we can change your statement so there's no more thinking about beginning of life is equal to bio-based. So for example, if we think about some of the companies that we're looking at, you could quote unquote say that beginning of life is trash or waste material from somewhere else. And so I think that's one thing to look forward to. I do think that one of the just key things to just mention is that there need to be a variety of solutions, because polymer properties and material properties are very different. So I can't necessarily say I want to make every product to be biodegradable. I'm not sure that I would want my PVC piping, for example, that is in my house or my sprinkler system to be biodegradable. Or my airplane wing composite to have biodegradable polymer if I want that to last for a while. So I do think that we need to not necessarily put all our eggs in one basket, and basically use the opportunity to not only advance new materials, but also think about the economics and the energy costs. So I know I talked about energy costs before, but I think that's a very important consideration that can help in some extent with the pricing pressures that we feel now.
I would just echo
Professor Corley.
Sure. I would just echo what Thomas says in terms of really thinking about the continuum of opportunities, right, of innovations that have been put on display here with this panelist and in other areas. This idea of really being able to think about, from a business perspective, from even educating consumers about how we use plastics, right? So thinking about the business case, the business model for what we're actually making and how we plan to use, recycle, all of those types of things. So there's an opportunity here, an educational opportunity for all of us from an academic standpoint, and how we train students who will then go off into join industry, national labs, other academic institutions, and really work with our policymakers to help us think about all of the different solutions, because there is absolutely no one size fits all.
Thank you very much. That is a perfect note to end. I do want to thank on a personal basis, Dr. Reena Singh, who helped make all this happen and who was constantly making sure we all had our stuff correct. And I know all your panelists have been inundated with her emails getting stuff in. So she's been instrumental in putting this webinar together, and we owe her a great debt of gratitude. So thank you, Reena, for that. And of course, the Delaware Prosperity Partnership, this is also very important for contributing to this webinar and supporting this activity. And specifically, I'm told that the governor of Delaware, John Carney, was the sponsor for this briefing, and the center for being part of this and doing stuff. And to you panelists, a round of applause. We have in the screen the clap mode somewhere. I don't know how to trigger that, but if I were you, I'd give you 1,000 claps. You guys all did a wonderful job. I appreciate it. I thank you very much, and have a safe week, and also stay well and stay safe. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Excellent, Professor Naran. Good.
Uh,
People still on.
We are still, let me first stop recording.